Nobody came to help him. Not his daughter, not his son-in-law, not the pastor who had shaken his hand every Sunday for 11 years. The only one who showed up was a three-legged shepherd mix named Copper, and Copper didn't have anywhere else to be either. Before this story begins, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Your city, your state, wherever you are. I'd love to see how far this one travels. The eviction notice had been taped to the door sometime in the night, while Everett Boone was sleeping in the back bedroom, with the windows cracked, because the furnace had been making that sound again. The grinding one. The one he kept telling himself he'd get looked at. He found it at 6 in the morning, still in his undershirt, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold before he finished making it. The notice was official. Yellow copy. The kind with carbon paper pressed through. He read it twice and then set it on the kitchen counter beside the sugar bowl because there wasn't anywhere else to put it. 68 years old. 22 years in the Army, 2 tours in the Gulf, 1 knee held together with hardware the VA had installed in 2009. He'd come back from worse than this. He told himself that while he stood in the kitchen and watched the morning light move across the linoleum floor, Copper found him there, the way Copper always found him. Appearing from the hallway with that quiet, uneven gait, front right leg, carrying more than its share, because the back left had been gone since before Everett adopted him from the shelter in Roanoke. The dog pressed his head against Everett's thigh without being asked. He always knew. The property had belonged to his wife, Miriam. When Miriam died, it had passed to their daughter, Joanna, which everyone agreed made sense at the time. Joanna lived 2 hours away in Charlottesville with her husband, a man named Philip Graves, who worked in real estate and had opinions about everything. Everett had been living in the house under a handshake agreement, which he understood now had been a mistake. Handshakes required 2 people to remember the same thing. The call with Joanna lasted 4 minutes. She was sorry the house needed to be liquidated to cover debt he hadn't known about. Philip was sorry too, she said, though Everett could hear nothing in the background that sounded like Philip. He needed to be out by the end of the week. He stood at the phone for a long time after she hung up. Copper sat beside him, leaning against his good knee, warm and steady and patient. What do you do when the floor disappears? You find out what you're actually standing on. Everett spent the next 3 days sorting through 40 years of accumulated living. He kept what fit in the truck: his field pack, his sleeping bag, 2 wool blankets, a cast-iron pan, his grandfather's folding knife, a box of medical supplies from when he used to change his own dressings, and the small waterproof tin he'd carried overseas that held 3 photographs and nothing else. Copper's food, his water bowl, a collar with a tag that said his name and Everett's phone number, though Everett wasn't sure how long that number would still be his. He left on a Thursday, no ceremony. He locked the door from the inside and went out through the kitchen window, the way he used to when he was late coming home as a teenager and didn't want to wake up my mother. He left the key on the counter beside the sugar bowl. Copper rode in the passenger seat, with his nose pressed to the gap in the window, reading the air the way dogs do, filing away information the rest of the world couldn't access. They headed west on 60, then north on a back road Everett remembered from years ago, when he and Miriam used to drive out this way just to drive, when the kids were young and a long road meant silence, and her hand on his arm and the mountains going dark at the edges. The Allegheny Mountains rose ahead of them, blue and old and indifferent, the way mountains always are. He hadn't made any decision exactly. He was just driving toward the only place that had ever made him feel like himself. He pulled off on a fire road that the county had stopped maintaining sometime in the 90s. The gate was rusted open, which he took as permission. They drove in about a mile before the truck bottomed out on a root cluster, and he decided that was far enough. They camped the first night under a stand of hemlock trees. He built a small fire, enough to push back the cold without advertising their position, which was a habit from overseas he'd never been able to shake. Copper circled twice and lay against Everett's leg, and Everett listened to the creek somewhere below them, invisible in the dark, and thought about very little. He woke before dawn with frost on his blanket, and a decision that hadn't been conscious but felt finished anyway. He wasn't going back. The second day they walked. Everett moved slowly because of the knee, and Copper moved slowly because that was his nature. Careful and deliberate, always placing each foot with intention. They followed the creek upstream, where the terrain tilted upward, and the trees thickened, and the sky narrowed to a pale strip above them. Copper stopped first. The dog went still in the way he did when something had his full attention, not alarmed exactly but deeply focused, his nose working the air in quick, precise movements. He took 3 steps forward and stopped again. Everett followed his gaze up the creek bank through a curtain of bare willow branches to a place where the rock face rose sharply, and the land folded back on itself in a shallow overhang. Beneath the overhang, set back maybe 10 feet from the creek, the rock wall was darker, hollow. He almost walked past it. The entrance was narrow, lower than a standard doorway, and the overhang threw everything into shadow. But Copper had already started moving toward it, unhurried and certain. Inside, Everett stood straight. The ceiling vaulted upward to roughly 8 feet at the peak, then sloped back down toward the far wall 25 feet away. The floor was packed earth and dry stone. Old leaves along the edges, undisturbed, which meant no flooding, no smell of animal, no evidence that anything had lived here recently, which was the first time in 4 days. Something had gone the way he needed it to. He pressed his palm against the back wall, dry, cold, but dry. He looked up and found the crack, a fissure in the stone running diagonally toward the surface, wide enough to push 2 fingers through, with a faint draw of air moving through it the way chimneys draw, naturally vented. He sat down on the cave floor and put his head in his hands and stayed there for a while. Copper pressed into his side and stayed there too. Finally, Everett lifted his head. "All right," he said. That was all he said. But Copper's tail moved twice, and Everett figured that was enough. The first thing was food. He'd brought enough supplies for a week if he stretched them. But a week was not a plan. A week was just not starving yet. He needed protein, and the creek was 15 feet away, which was either luck or the mountain telling him something. He walked the creek bank for half a mile, reading the water. He was looking for slack water, places where the current lost its urgency, and pooled in the shadow of submerged stones, where fish rested. He found 3 such places. The best one was a natural bend where a fallen oak redirected the current and left a still oval of dark water about the size of a kitchen table. He couldn't fish it yet. The water was too fast above the bend, and fish holding in slack water could scatter with a careless footstep. He needed to think about it differently. He spent the rest of the afternoon gathering stones, river stones, smooth and heavy, the kind that fit together without mortar if you chose them right. He worked slowly, carrying them to the bend in his arms, 2 or 3 at a time, because his back didn't allow more. Copper supervised from the bank, occasionally retrieving a stone that had rolled away, bringing it back with a look of intense personal accomplishment. It took 2 days to build the weir. Not a full dam. He wasn't trying to change the creek, just convince it to slow down in one place. He built a curved stone wall angled upstream, so the current would press it tighter instead of pushing it apart. A design he half remembered from a field manual and half invented on the spot. The water backed up behind it gradually, the slack pool deepening and widening, going from knee-deep to waist-deep over 24 hours. On the second morning, he crouched at the edge of the pool in the gray early light and looked down. Shadows moved below the surface, several of them, long and slow. Copper sat beside him, looking at the exact same shadows. "That's dinner," Everett said. Copper's ears moved forward. Getting dinner required patience and a piece of line he'd salvaged from the truck, a hook from his emergency kit, and a worm from the creek bank. He fished for an hour before the first trout took the bait, and the way it broke the surface and caught the light, that moment of bright cold silver coming up from the dark water. He felt something move in his chest that wasn't grief and wasn't hope, but was somewhere between the two. He cleaned the fish at the creek's edge and cooked it over a small fire that evening, with a few wild onions he'd found growing near the water. Copper received the first portion. He always did. The shelter needed real work. The entrance was manageable in mild weather, but would be fatal in a serious cold snap. He needed a wall, something to break the wind and hold the heat of a fire. He spent 4 days cutting and hauling timber, working in the morning when his back was loosest, and resting in the afternoon when it tightened. Copper stayed close, sometimes carrying smaller branches, sometimes just pacing nearby in a way that suggested moral support. He had the hatchet and the knife, and his hands, which was not ideal, but was what there was. He notched the logs at the corners, where they crossed, and packed the gaps with clay from the creek bank. The wall wasn't beautiful, but it was square, and when he stood inside and pressed his hand against it, there was no draft. He built the door from 3 flat boards he'd stripped from a collapsed section of fence he found a quarter-mile upstream. He hung it on pegs cut from green wood, and it swung, not smoothly, but it swung. When he latched it against the frame, the interior of the cave went almost completely still. The fire was the harder problem. He set the first one in the center of the cave floor, which seemed obvious, and nearly killed them both. The smoke had nowhere to go. It curled down from the ceiling and pooled along the ground. And within minutes, Copper was coughing, and Everett's eyes were streaming, and he had to kick the fire apart and haul them both outside into the cold air. He sat on the rock ledge outside the entrance and coughed until his ribs hurt. And when the coughing stopped, he was just angry. Everything hurt. His knee had swollen from the timber work. His hands were cut from the stone. He'd lost 12 pounds in 10 days and could feel it in the looseness of his belt and the way his legs didn't trust themselves on uneven ground anymore. He pressed his fist against the rock face once, hard. "Not today," he said. "Not this." Copper pressed against his leg. Everett looked down at the dog. 3 legs, gray around the muzzle, calm as a stone. And something in him settled. "Fine, let's figure it out." He went back inside and studied the fissure he'd noticed the first day. He held a piece of burning bark near it and watched the smoke move. The fissure drew, but weakly. The problem was that the fire had been too far from the draw. He needed to build the fire under the fissure and channel the smoke toward it, the way a fireplace needs a throat, a narrowing that concentrates the draw. He spent a day building a stone firebox beneath the fissure, flat stones arranged in a rough funnel shape, wider at the base, narrowing upward toward the crack in the ceiling. He packed clay between the stones and into the lower section of the fissure to smooth the flow. Then he built a small test fire. The smoke rose, hesitated, and then bent toward the fissure and disappeared upward through the stone. He watched it for a full minute without moving. Then he sat back on his heels and let himself breathe all the way out. Copper wagged his tail once, authoritative. "Yeah," Everett said. "I see it." They had heat after that. Real, steady heat, the kind that climbs the walls and holds in the stone, and is still present the next morning when the fire has burned to coals. The cave went from a cold storage space to something that felt, if not like a home, then at least like a place where a person could think clearly. He was out checking the weir on a Tuesday morning. The fish had become more reliable as the pool deepened, and he developed a loose routine of fishing at dawn, when Copper froze. Not the curious freeze he used when he'd found something interesting. This was the other kind. The flattened ears, the spine-level alertness that Everett recognized from years of working with trained dogs overseas. Something was approaching. Everett straightened and scanned the tree line above the creek. The forest was still. Then a shape separated itself from the shadows between 2 oaks, and he saw it was a person, elderly. A woman in her 70s moving carefully down the slope, with a walking stick she was clearly familiar with. She wore a heavy canvas coat and rubber barn boots and a wool hat pulled low. She wasn't hurrying. She wasn't hiding. She stopped at 10 yards and looked at him directly. "Saw your smoke yesterday," she said, "and the day before. Wanted to make sure you were all right up here. Everett kept one hand near Copper's collar. I'm all right. She looked at the weir and then at the cave entrance behind him. Her expression wasn't nosy. It was something closer to recognition. Did that yourself? She asked. He nodded. She seemed to consider this for a moment. My name is Adeline Pruitt. My family's had land on the North Slope for 4 generations. She paused. You military? He looked at her. Army. 22 years. She nodded, as though this explained something she'd already guessed. I've got a son who did 3 tours in Afghanistan, she said. He's got a place down in Staunton now, doing better than he was. She looked at Copper. What happened to his leg? Don't know, Everett said. Had it that way when I got him. She reached into the canvas bag she was carrying and produced a cloth-wrapped parcel, which she set on a flat rock near the creek. 2 jars, one dark, one pale, a block of yellow cheese, a folded piece of waxed paper that turned out to contain cornbread. I'm not taking charity, Everett said. Adeline looked at him without blinking. I'm not offering charity, she said. I'm being neighborly. There's a difference and you know it. He stood there for a moment. Then he picked up the parcel. Thank you, he said. She bent down and looked at Copper directly. The dog looked back at her, assessing, and then, slowly, his tail moved. Adeline straightened and smiled just slightly. Good dog, she said. You picked a decent spot, she added back to Everett. That cave's been there a long time. Floods never reach it. Rock above it is solid, but you'll want to watch the ridge when the weather shifts. This mountain gets mean in February. I know mean, Everett said. She studied him for another moment. I believe you do. Then she turned and began the slow climb back up the slope, her walking stick steady on the frozen ground. He watched her go, and he didn't fully understand what he was feeling until she'd disappeared between the trees. Then he placed it. It was the particular weight that lifts when someone sees you clearly and doesn't look away. The warning about February arrived sooner than expected. He woke 4 days later to a pressure in his ears he recognized from high altitude, the kind of drop that precedes something serious. The sky was a flat, uniform gray that had no variation in it, and the air smelled of iron. The temperature had fallen 15 degrees since the previous evening. Copper stood at the entrance with his nose lifted, reading it all. I know, Everett said. He spent the morning laying in firewood, moving fast despite the knee, because there was no alternative to moving fast. He stacked 2 days' worth inside the cave against the far wall, then went out for a 3rd load because 2 days wasn't enough. His breath came in short bursts that fogged and disappeared. The first snowflakes arrived while he was on his 2nd trip, sparse and light, almost casual, the way serious storms announce themselves. By afternoon, the wind had changed. It came in long, sustained pushes from the northwest that bent the hemlocks and drove snow sideways through the trees. Everett sealed every gap in the doorframe with strips of cloth and bark, then sat inside and listened to the storm build. It built slowly, the way bad things do. By dark, it was screaming. He kept the fire through the night, feeding it every 2 hours. Waking by instinct the way soldiers do when they've trained themselves to sleep in intervals. Copper slept against him, the dog's warmth pressing steadily into Everett's ribs, rising and falling in a rhythm that was easier to listen to than the wind. Sometime near 3 in the morning, Copper raised his head. Everett was already awake. The fire was wrong. The smoke was moving wrong. It was curling down from the ceiling, instead of rising toward the fissure, pooling across the floor in low, dense layers. The fissure had blocked. He could feel the air thickening, taste the bitterness at the back of his throat. He moved fast. He kicked the fire apart to reduce the smoke, soaked his bandana in the water from his canteen, pressed it to his face, and went to the door. It resisted. Snow had packed against it, and he shouldered it open with a grunt, spilling into the dark and the screaming wind and the snow that came at him from every direction at once. The rock face above the cave entrance was buried in 3 feet of drifted snow. He couldn't see the fissure. He climbed by feel, one hand on the rock, one hand keeping the bandana against his face, finding holds in the stone with numb fingers that stopped reporting information within the first 2 minutes. The snow above the fissure had crusted in a solid sheet. He hit it with the heel of his hand first. Then with a rock he pulled from the ledge, chipping at the crust in the dark, with wind ripping at his coat and ice forming in his eyebrows. "Come on," he said. Not to himself exactly, just out loud, just because the alternative to speaking was the silence underneath the storm. The crust gave. Not all at once, but in pieces, breaking apart with a hollow crack, and then the air moved. He could feel it even through the bandana. The fissure pulling again, the draft restored. He climbed down slower than he'd climbed up. His hands had gone from painful to quiet, which was worse. He found the door by sound. Copper barking on the other side, sharp and insistent, and pushed through into the smoke-thinned air of the cave. He crawled to the fire and rebuilt it with shaking hands, feeding kindling first, then larger pieces, watching the smoke lift and begin its slow drift toward the ceiling and the fissure and the cold sky above. Clean. Drawing clean. Copper pushed himself against Everett's chest and stayed there. Everett wrapped both arms around the dog and held on. His hands came back slowly, painfully, the blood returning in pulses that felt like small fires under the skin. He pressed them between Copper's ribs and his own stomach and waited it out. He didn't sleep again. He fed the fire and watched the smoke and listened to the storm grind itself out against the mountain through what remained of the night. Dawn was quiet, genuinely quiet, the snow silence that follows a serious storm. Everything muffled and softened and strange. Everett opened the door onto a landscape that had been remade, white in every direction. The hemlock branches bowed under their loads. The creek was audible but invisible beneath a skin of ice. Copper bounded out into the snow and immediately sank to his chest, which appeared to genuinely surprise him. He looked back at Everett with an expression of complete bewilderment. Everett laughed. It came out of him without warning. A real laugh, the kind that requires something in the chest to loosen first. "You'll manage," he said. Adeline came down the slope 2 hours later, moving carefully through the new snow with her walking stick probing ahead of each step. She carried a knapsack this time, heavier than before. She stopped at the cave entrance and looked at the door, the wall, the chimney smoke rising clean and straight into the cold air. "You kept the fire," she said. "Had to clear the vent in the night," Everett said. She looked at his hands, which still showed the marks of the cold. She didn't say anything about them. She set the knapsack on the rock shelf near the entrance. Inside, salt pork, dried beans, a small sack of cornmeal, matches in a waterproof tin, and a paperback Bible with a broken spine that she didn't mention and he didn't comment on. "You're going to need more to that weir when the ice clears," she said. "The fish will be holding deeper in February." She paused. "And there are 2 men from over the county line who run trap lines up on the north slope. They don't like company." Everett nodded. "I'm not looking for trouble." "No," Adeline said. "But trouble's got a way of not caring about that." She left before noon. He watched her go up the slope and thought about Miriam. Not in a way that hurt, exactly, but in the way that certain smells bring back rooms you haven't been in for years. Adeline moved nothing like Miriam. But the kindness was the same kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself. He went inside and sorted the supplies with methodical care, finding places for each thing against the cave wall. He labeled nothing, because he'd know where everything was. He always knew where everything was. The weeks that followed were the hardest and the simplest he could remember. Hard because the body had its limits and he was past the age where he could ignore them. Simple because every day had a clear purpose. Stay warm, stay fed, stay dry. There was a relief in that clarity he hadn't expected. 40 years of complicated living, and it turned out what he needed was a fire that worked and a dog who stayed close and a creek that didn't lie to him. He developed a routine. Dawn, check the weir, fish if they were running. Morning, firewood. Midday, repairs to the wall, to the door frame, to whatever the previous night had damaged. Afternoon, rest, though he rarely let himself fully rest, more a kind of slow stillness that passed for it. Evening, cook, eat, talk to Copper, which he did openly now, without embarrassment, because there was no one to be embarrassed in front of. He was cutting kindling one afternoon when Copper went rigid. Different again from the storm night alertness or the curious freeze when Adeline came. This was the one Everett had only seen twice before, both times overseas. Someone was in the trees. Everett set down the hatchet and stood slowly. He didn't reach for anything. He just stood with his hands visible and waited. Two men came out of the tree line above the creek, moving with the particular carelessness of people who are accustomed to not being challenged. They were younger than Everett by 20 years, dressed for the cold, carrying trapping equipment. They stopped when they saw him. The taller one looked at the cave, the wall, the chimney. His face did something that wasn't pleasant. "This your setup?" he said. Everett looked at him evenly. "That's right. You know this is private timber?" the man said. Everett said nothing. "Adeline Pruitt's land is North Slope," the man said. "This here's county land. Anybody can make a claim to it." "Nobody's made a claim," Everett said. "We're making one now." Copper had positioned himself in front of Everett without being told, his body low, his attention absolute. The three-legged dog who could barely cross a snow-covered creek had become something else entirely, something that the taller man looked at and then looked away from. The second man touched the taller one's arm and said something too low to hear. The taller man looked at the cave, at Copper, at Everett's hands and face. Whatever he was calculating, he finished calculating it. "We'll be back," he said. "That's your business," Everett said. They went back into the tree line, and he listened to their footsteps until he couldn't. Then he exhaled. Copper turned and pressed his head into Everett's hand. "Good work," Everett said quietly. "Real good work," he told Adeline when she came by 2 days later. She listened with her arms folded, her expression controlled in the way of people who have heard worse. "Lester Crane and his cousin," she said. "They run about 4 miles of trapline on the county parcel north of the creek. They're not good men, but they're not bold men either," she said. "The dog changes their thinking." Copper looked up at her. "He's changed a lot of thinking," Everett said. Adeline's expression softened, just at the edges. She reached into her coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. "She set it on the rock shelf, my son's number," she said, "in Staunton. In case something happens when I can't get down here." Everett looked at the paper. He didn't pick it up immediately. "I'm not asking you to call him," she said. "Just to have it." He picked it up. March came without ceremony. The snow didn't disappear so much as diminish, retreating from the south-facing slopes first, leaving patches of brown matted grass that Copper investigated with great interest. The creek went from silent to audible to loud, carrying the melt down from the ridges, and the weir backed up into a pool that darkened with fish, working the new current. Everett was crouched at the pool one morning, watching a large trout hold in the current near the stone wall, when he heard Copper make a sound behind him. Not a warning, something lower and softer. The sound the dog made when someone he'd already decided was all right came around. He turned to find Adeline on the bank behind him, and beside her, a man in his 40s with her same square jaw and her same steady way of standing. He was carrying 2 packs, which was more than she usually brought. "This is my son," Adeline said. "Thomas." Thomas Pruitt extended his hand. Everett shook it. "Mom's told me about your setup up here," Thomas said. He was looking at the weir, the cave entrance visible through the trees, the thin line of smoke from the chimney. He didn't look like a man who gave compliments easily. "He's got good eyes," Everett thought. "Careful." "Heard you had a rough night in the storm," Thomas said. "Handled it," Everett said. Thomas nodded. "I know," he said. "That's why I wanted to meet you." They ate lunch on the rock shelf outside the cave entrance. The 4 of them. Everett and Thomas, and Adeline and Copper. And Thomas talked about his time overseas in a way that Everett recognized, the spare, factual way men talk about things they've metabolized, but not forgotten. He'd done 3 tours, like Adeline said. He'd come home twice angry and once quiet, and the quiet was worse. He had a wife and a daughter in Staunton and a counselor he saw on Thursdays. "You ever think about coming back into town?" Thomas asked. Everett looked at the creek, the weir, the mountain above them, pale and enormous. "Eventually," he said. Not yet. Thomas nodded like he understood the answer and wasn't going to push on it. Before he left, Thomas set something on the rock shelf beside the door. A short-wave radio, battery-operated, the kind Everett had used in the field. Thomas gave him 2 sets of spare batteries wrapped in a rubber band. For weather, Thomas said. And, in case. Everett looked at the radio for a moment. Thank you, he said. Thomas picked up Copper's ear gently and looked at the dog. You're something, he said. Copper accepted this without ego. They climbed back up the slope together. Mother and son, their voices lost in the wind before they reached the tree line. Everett sat outside the cave for a long time after they left. The radio in his lap, the creek talking below him, Copper settled against his leg. He thought about Miriam, and how she used to say that the people who stayed in your life weren't always the ones you expected. She meant it about friends, about family, about the way things realign after loss. He hadn't understood it fully when she said it. He thought he understood it better now. He carved something into the wall just inside the cave entrance, low down where the stone was smooth. He used the folding knife, working slowly. 2 names and a word, Everett and Copper, stayed. It wasn't much, it wasn't supposed to be. It was just the truth, which is usually enough. He was checking the roofline for ice buildup the following week. A habit now, the kind of maintenance that had become second nature. When Copper nosed past him into the far back corner of the cave, the dark section he'd never fully explored, the dog pawed at the stone wall and then stepped back and sat down, looking at Everett with the expression he used when he'd found something, and was waiting to see if the human would keep up. Everett brought the lantern. The back wall wasn't a wall. It was a narrowing, a point where the cave tapered toward a seam in the rock that was wider than it looked. He held the lantern to it and felt the air moving, not toward the fissure above the hearth, but outward, horizontal, sustained. Something on the other side was breathing. He looked at Copper. Copper wagged his tail. Everett pressed 2 fingers into the seam. The stone shifted. Not much, but it moved, the way stone moves when it's sitting against other stone, and has been for a very long time, patient and waiting for something to push it just enough. He didn't open it that night. He rebuilt the fire and ate and lay down with Copper and listened to the wind in the creek and the deep quiet that had become ordinary now. The kind of quiet you could live inside, the kind that had room in it for something else. In the morning, he would look at what was on the other side, but first he let himself sleep, really sleep, the dreamless kind, the kind that used to be impossible and wasn't anymore. The fire held. Copper breathed. The mountain held everything in its old, wordless way, the way it had been doing long before either of them arrived and would keep doing long after. But right now it was holding them. And that was enough.